My name is Bob Vastine. I'm Senior Industry Fellow at the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown. It's a pleasure to have you join us here today. We had a sign-up of 60. We aren't all assembled, and we may get some more stragglers, so we'll just carry on in spite of that. The metal detector. Okay, well, we have to start, so metal detector or no. The center is housed at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. It is an academic and nonpartisan research center that seeks to engage scholars, business people, and policymakers in discussion, research, and publication on issues of importance to the public policy process. It was created in 2002. It tries to encourage open discussion and dissemination of information, and thus we videotape each of these sessions, so as you can see here, and we encourage press coverage, and these tapes are available about 3 days after the event, or next week, certainly by Monday, at cbpp.georgetown.edu. So we are very pleased with our series, how our series on trade policy has been going. This is the fifth. We are planning a sixth one on April 23rd here in this room to discuss the critical role of inward and outward foreign investment on U.S. economic development and on jobs. So if anybody is not on our invitation list or knows somebody who should be, please just contact Elizabeth, whom I think you met at the door. So after a year of deliberation, leaders of the European Union and the U.S. have agreed to start a negotiation called the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Trade and Investment Partnership, to expand a market that already accounts for half of global GDP and about 30% of trade, but is challenged by faster-growing economies, mainly in Asia. For Europe, the stakes are particularly high. As Asian countries begin to combine in regional agreements like the TPP, the China-Japan-Korea Agreement, and the ASEP, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the nexus of economic activity is focused there in Asia, and Europe really has an outsider's role. It must try to offset this with an agreement with the US and, it hopes, Japan. So the leaders have set the bar very high for the TTP, the TTIP. It's to be an ambitious, comprehensive agreement that embraces trade, all trade, services, goods, and agriculture, investment, and regulatory issues, of which much has been made. Leaders have stressed the need for a very strong political commitment to get a deal done. But solving some of the really vexing problems in EU-US relations, some which have plagued our relationship since the formation of the common market a long time ago, 1957 and the 50s, such as agriculture subsidies and market access, financial and food safety regulation, personal privacy protection, Europe's block on US cultural content, maritime protectionism in the United States, will demand a strength of political determination that many on both sides of the Atlantic doubt can be summoned. So our panel of stakeholders and analysts will assess, in light of the realities of this highly complex relationship, the agreement's promise of a transatlantic relationship that resolves embedded commercial issues, transcends decades of mutual distrust, and creates a new solidarity of purpose. So we have an excellent panel here. And I'd like to begin with John Herrmann. John is a partner at the Kelly Drye law firm. He chaired Governor Romney's Trade Policy Advisory Committee, bringing expertise gained in his post as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Trade, Energy, and Environment at the National Security Council under President Bush. Previously, he was Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Import Administration. Thea is Deputy Chief of Staff at the AFL-CIO, where she has also been Policy Director and Chief International Economist. Thea is a very well-known and highly respected proponent of the views of the labor movement on international economic issues. She also serves on the State Department Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy and is a member of the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Dave Salmonsen is Senior Director of Government Relations with the Farm Bureau and a well-known spokesman in Washington trade circles for the Bureau and America's farmers. We were joking earlier, he should know about farming because he grew up on a farm, a family farm, still in the family, and in a prior job worked in the New York State Department of Agriculture. And in spite of the fact that he's a lawyer, he really does know the intricacies of the international agricultural economy and our efforts over decades to try to sort them out. Michael Smart. Mike Smart is a partner in the international consulting firm, Rock Creek Global Advisors. He has a wealth of knowledge and experience in international trade and international investment issues, has been International Trade Counsel for Senate Chairman Baucus in the Senate Finance Committee, and also Director for International Trade and Investment at the National Security Council. He's practiced law at the Sidley Austin Law Firm. So let's begin then with John Herrmann and then move down the table. John, thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, Bob, for that nice introduction and the opportunity to be here today and the opportunity to see many familiar faces. As the person responsible for kicking off the discussion today, I thought I'd spend a few minutes kind of putting the US-EU relationship in perspective and talking about a little bit of the history that's gotten us to where we are today and how that might predict where things are going to end up on the negotiation of a broader free trade agreement. So first, in terms of the overall economic relationship between the US and the EU, the transatlantic economy accounts for more than half of global GDP. The US and EU combined account for about 25% of global exports, approximately a third of global imports, and have mutual investment stocks in each other's economy of $3.5 trillion. There have been several projections in terms of what benefits might be generated by a US-EU trade agreement. There are differing projections based on the scope and ambition of the agreement. There's been a projection that going to zero on tariffs, which currently are not hugely significant. They average about less than 3%. But the projected impact on GDP is about a percentage point to a percentage point and a third in the United States, and about a third of a percentage point to half a percentage point in the EU. There have also been projections on a more comprehensive agreement that would involve eliminating non-tariff barriers, agreements on services, government procurement, and other issues that would be part of a broader agreement. And an agreement like that has been estimated to result in an increase in GDP of about 1.5%, both for the United States and the EU. Given that the IMF has projected fairly modest growth, both in the United States and the EU in the next several years, projections of 3% or so in the United States and about 1/10 of that, or a 1/3 of a percent in the EU. Even some relatively modest numbers when you combine an elimination of tariffs and look at a broader agreement as well, can have a pretty significant impact on each side's economy. Now, in terms of the historical perspective, there have been at least 3 efforts over the last 15 years or so to deepen economic relations between the U.S. and the EU. Probably the first of which bears mention, is the new transatlantic marketplace proposal that Sir Leon Brittan came forward with in 1998. Sought to make progress in 4 key areas: removal of technical barriers to trade, or TBTs, eliminating industrial tariffs by 2010 as long as there were movements by other major trading countries, pursuing a free trade area in services, and finally pursuing liberalization on investment, public procurement, and intellectual property. The second main initiative, which I'll talk about in more depth in just a minute here, is the Transatlantic Economic Council, which was established during the US-EU Summit in June of 2007. And obviously where we are today is kind of the third main era to talk about, as Bob mentioned, with the launch of the expression of intent to launch negotiations on the TTIP, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, with respect to the TEC, it was an initiative that, as I mentioned, resulted from the US-EU summit in 2007. I think it's fair to say it was pushed fairly aggressively by Chancellor Merkel during the German presidency of the European Council, reflected her commitment to deepening transatlantic economic relations. And what it sought to accomplish was raising trade frictions to a very high political level. The discussion was chaired by Günter Verheugen, who was one of 5 vice presidents of the Commission and the Commissioner for Enterprise and Industry on the European side, and by Al Hubbard, who was the Assistant to the President for Economic Affairs, and the head of the National Economic Council on the U.S. side. And the dialogue continues to be chaired at a very high level today, with the Trade Commissioner de Gucht on the European side and Mike Froman, the Deputy National Security Advisor on the U.S. side. And the TEC initially sought to make progress on 5 lighthouse projects or initiatives. Intellectual property rights, where there was a move to increase enforcement, including the exchange of information on infringing products and harmonized patent regimes. Secure trade, where the objective was to move forward with mutual recognition of secure supply chain programs on each side. Financial markets, in terms of the mutual recognition of accounting standards. A host of issues on innovation and technology, including health-related issues, interoperability of health records, RFID technology, nanotechnology, and a host of others. And finally, to establish a dialogue on investment issues, which, at least as initially formed, provided an opportunity to talk about sovereign wealth funds and national security reviews, and has evolved from there. The TEC has met 6 times. Well, it's made some progress on issues. Regulatory cooperation, I think it's done quite well. There has been progress on secure trade, mutual recognition, and accounting standards. I think it's also fair to say that the TEC has fallen short in resolving some of the most deep trade frictions between Europe and the United States. Most notably on the U.S. side was a key issue back after the TEC was initially formed, which was the European prohibition on antimicrobial washes used in processing poultry in the United States, or chicken, as those of us involved in the time like to refer to it. While not much progress was made there, I'm sure someone on the European side would push back and say, well, there was also an equal lack of progress on suppliers' declarations of conformity, which was an objective the Europeans had, which would have allowed their manufacturers of consumer electronics products to self-certify that their products met safety standards. I think, frankly, at bottom, one of the problems with the TEC in terms of the concept of using it to resolve deep trade frictions is the fact that there were a limited number of issues that each side was raising, which made it very hard to move and frankly created kind of a zero-sum negotiating environment where if there wasn't going to be movement on poultry, there wasn't going to be movement on S-stock, and as a result, it became very hard to make progress. Now, in terms of where we are today, I think there are some reasons why the TTIP may be poised to move forward more quickly. I think there's also some reasons why it may be difficult to move forward. On the positive side, I think the fact that there is slower growth in the United States and Europe creates an incentive for a bigger deal, and certainly is something that is first and foremost at the mind of many Europeans that I talk to, that there's a newfound desire to use this as an opportunity to increase growth in Europe. I think there's an opportunity to use the TTIP as an opportunity to establish standards that will be important in engaging the emerging economies, the BRICS. I think the fact that the negotiation is going forward is also a tacit recognition that the Doha round negotiations are hopelessly stalled at this point. I think both the Europeans and the Americans are and continue to be committed to the idea of a multilateral agreement. But I think the fact that this negotiation is going forward at this time reflects a recognition on both sides that this may be an opportunity to make progress in the near term. With respect to some of the difficulties that these negotiations are going to face, I think many of the old frictions continue to linger: GMOs, geographic indicators, ag market access, all of the issues that I'm sure Dave is going to talk about in a minute here. And I guess one other concern I will mention is the time frame that has been set out for these negotiations. 2 years is a very, very short time to conclude an agreement this broad and this difficult, and I think it's made particularly more difficult given the other negotiations that each side has going on, with the U.S. looking to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations by the end of 2013. The prospect of Japan joining those negotiations, I think, will make that deadline even more difficult. And frankly, with the EU's announcement this morning that it's going to be going forward with negotiations with the Japanese, means that each side is going to be negotiating a very major agreement at the same time it's looking to quickly conclude the TTIP negotiations. It'll be interesting to see how those competing priorities get balanced. So, in conclusion, I think the prospect of the TTIP going forward has a great opportunity to give new momentum to global efforts to liberalize trade, has an opportunity to establish a benchmark against which other agreements will be measured. I'm not terribly optimistic that there will be an agreement in 2 years. I'd be delighted to be proved wrong with that. But I think instead what you'll see is the agreement going forward in fits and starts, and hopefully over the long run a comprehensive agreement that will benefit both sides.
Thank you, John. Thea.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, both with my illustrious co-panelists, with all of you, but also because I think this topic is intriguing and it opens up some interesting new avenues. And the AFL-CIO, the labor movement, has been, as you all know, somewhat skeptical, I would say, of trade agreements or the prospects of trade agreements. And for the most part, I would say partly not our fault, but because both the agreements have been oversold and because the concerns that we've raised within the context of these agreements have not always been at the top of the negotiating agenda. So Bob asked us to talk about the promise and the reality of the U.S.-EU trade discussions. And to be honest, at this moment, there's a lot more promise than there is reality, and the reality is a 90-day discussion period or comment period for the U.S. But I think there's also the promise, and then there is the prospect or the potential of roadblocks or problems or obstacles that might arise, and John, I think, has laid out some of those. And we probably have a different list in the labor movement of what our concerns might be. But we are open-minded at this moment in time. We do believe that there's more potential for U.S.-EU to have an interesting discussion, to have a fruitful discussion that is mutually beneficial for workers and the economies on both sides of the Atlantic. But we also have some significant concerns. And so I think there's been a lot in the press that's announced that the AFL-CIO is supporting the EU talks. We can't support something that doesn't exist, and we certainly wouldn't support something we hadn't seen. But so I'll start by going through the promise. I think some of the areas in which this is a promising agreement are obvious. It's a major market for us. And it's also, the European Union is overall an area with strong labor standards, strong labor unions, good labor laws, and pretty good enforcement of those labor laws, in many aspects superior to the United States. If you're just ranking countries in terms of strength of labor protections, certainly the European Union would rank very high. And we have strong partners in the European Union, the European Trade Union Confederation, but also the national labor centers in each of the European countries are people we've worked with for many years. We have a lot of respect, a lot of shared perspective. We don't agree on everything, as you might imagine, but it's certainly a great relationship there. And beyond that, the regulatory regime in the European Union, I would say, characterized in general as robust environmental, consumer, health and safety protections. And so we don't have some of the concerns we might have with some past trading partners, that there would be a lot of undermining of U.S. standards in a free trade agreement, or a lot of incentive for U.S. companies to move production in order to take advantage of lax regulatory regime, weak workers' rights. But it's, so that's the starting point. In terms of the issues that might arise, the potential problems, even within the labor standards chapter, and I think this is an important point for us because it's not obvious, it's not intuitive for a lot of folks. We are looking, certainly we would expect within the context of the TTIP, if we're really going to call it that, I guess we are, within the context of the TTIP, that we would want a strong and enforceable chapter on labor standards. And as I'd said, you know, the European Union has high labor standards in general, and yet the European Union, in its negotiation of trade agreements with partners in the past, has never sought strong enforcement mechanisms in its labor chapter. They just have a different approach to the labor chapter, which is they lay out a lot of hortatory goals, a lot of rhetoric in the preamble. Everybody loves labor standards are good, everybody should comply with that, but they've stopped short in most cases from any kind of enforcement mechanism. And those of you who are familiar, and I think many of you are, with the U.S. trade debate know that certainly for the labor movement, it has been an absolute bottom line for us that we want both strong provisions in our labor and environment chapters, but we also want strong enforcement mechanisms. And what we've generally said is we want the same kinds of enforcement mechanisms that these agreements have for commercial provisions, whether it's market access or intellectual property rights or investment rules. So we want parity, and that's something that may or may not be an obstacle as the negotiations move forward. We hope it won't be, but it's something that we would flag. We also would look to the labor chapter as an opportunity to build on the concept that a good trade agreement, a good trade and investment agreement, would be one that strengthens and protects workers and workers' rights, and maybe would take advantage of some of the strengths on both sides of the Atlantic. So for us, the concept of works councils, for example, in the European Union, where worker representatives actually sit on the boards of companies, is something that's intriguing. I don't think it's something you would legislate in a trade agreement, but it might be something that you would encourage and that you would support. Similarly, there could be transparency advantages of reporting that might be improved, that could be agreed potentially between the United States and the European Union in this context. And we would certainly hope that there would be a strong voice for labor unions and for civil society in general as the trade agreement progresses. And we think that's probably maybe the easiest part of this, because the European Union has a much more institutional acceptance of the role of labor and business that they call the social partners, along with government, in terms of some decision making. They sometimes bring their unions to the table as part of the negotiating team. That seems to us a very, very good direction to go for this. But one other area of concern is certainly, I made a blanket statement, the European Union in general has strong regulations and strong labor standards, and some of those are European Union wide. But it's also true that the European Union is not monolithic, with 27 countries and very different levels of protections in some of the countries. Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Slovakia, even Poland and Hungary, not new EU members, but are places where there has been, let's say, different levels of commitment to respecting workers' rights and to really crafting an economic agenda around strong job creation and strong protections for workers. And so I think, and then of course there are pending entrants, Montenegro, Serbia, Turkey, that could also present problems of their own. So I think it's important that we keep that full picture in mind when we think about the European Union, and we don't assume that it is a place that's free of labor issues. Because of course, and this is something that has come up in past FTA negotiations, even wealthy countries, certainly the United States, the fact of being an industrialized, wealthy, democratic nation doesn't mean that there aren't tensions in industrial relations, labor, and business. And so that's one of the reasons why we are so insistent that if we're going to deepen this economic integration, that we do so in a way that has strong and enforceable protections for workers' rights in case a problem does arise. Second issue is just a broad framing issue in terms of the net job creation prospects. I think John mentioned that there are the projected benefits. I think over the next 6 months or a year, we're going to start to see more of the studies that project how fabulous the TTIP will be for job creation, certainly in the United States, probably in Europe as well. And I think we would just caution that we need to take all of these projections with a couple of buckets of salt, because they tend not to be that accurate in the prospective. And sometimes they miss the real dynamic of what's going on in the agreement, because obviously the U.S. and the European Union already have a very robust, healthy trade relationship. We have about $116 billion trade deficit in goods with the European Union in 2012. And we always look to the existing trade agreement to see where the areas of vulnerability or potential problems might be. And certainly we see that the European Union is one of the areas, and I think probably Dave and maybe Michael will talk about this also, that as with many of our trade agreement partners, it's the non-tariff barriers where the problems arise, the areas where there are no apparent tariffs that would be blocking market access, and yet somehow the market access doesn't happen. What we've found in the past is that our trade negotiators are not particularly good at negotiating away those non-tariff barriers. And so I think that's something to keep an eye on in the European Union context. Third issue is regulatory harmonization. Okay, I'll wrap it up. Regulatory harmonization, and maybe we'll have more conversation about that in the context of this panel. But just to say, from our point of view, from the labor point of view, it's this is a potential danger zone, as well as a potential area of progress, because I think the corporate concerns around regulatory harmonization don't always align exactly with those of the labor and civil society and consumer groups, that we would certainly be looking to an upward harmonization of regulatory standards, and also to make sure that the trade agreement doesn't undermine democratic decision-making processes. For us, that's an important principle. It's something that we've raised both in the context of developing country trade deals as well as industrialized country. And I think with the European Union, this will be an important issue. So why don't I end there so we have time for discussion. And just to say in summary, whether the TTIP happens, what impact it ends up having, will depend in the end on the content. And also, if we think about it this way, what problem is the TTIP solving? Is the problem that we don't have enough trade between the United States and Europe? Is the problem that our tariffs are too high? Is the problem that our regulatory regimes are not in harmony with each other? Is the problem that we both need more jobs? Because it's going to be better at solving some of those problems than others, and we should make sure we have a realistic frame in terms of what the domestic economic impact is going to be. We should make sure the process is both inclusive and transparent, and that we respect the democratic processes. Thank you. I look forward to the rest of the panel and your questions.
Thank you very much. Very good close. Dave.
Okay. Well, first, For those of you who work in Hill offices here, thank you, because this has been the last 4 or 5 weeks have been our Farm Bureau members from across the country have been coming to town and coming to lobby on the Hill, so thank you for visiting with them. To talk about what's going on with the TTIP, I want to put our ag trade into some context. You know, we have two-way ag trade with the European Union of about $26 billion. You know, China, we have two-way ag trade about $27 billion, U.S., Canada, $40 billion, Mexico, $36 billion. But then when you dig down what's behind that trade, and which really shows why we have such an interest in this, with China, we export $23 billion, we import $4 billion. Canada and Mexico are about even. The EU, we send them not quite $9 billion a year in ag and food products. We import $16.5 billion a year. So we think we've got a lot of potential to make up to do here. And then what is in those numbers? What actually are we trading? Well, I think everybody will be happy to hear, and I'm sure we all enjoy that we do a very brisk trade in wine and beer, in which we have no tariffs on beer in either country, either place, and low tariffs on wine. Though it is quite skewed to one country. We take in over $5 billion a year of European wines and beers. And we send them about $400 million of our products in that. The rest of our exports are ag exports are soybeans, tree nuts, fruits and vegetables, wheat products. So what we see, there's a lot of potential. And as John was mentioning in his discussion about the tech and the saga of the poultry, you know, we have a lot of ag trade with the EU, and we have a lot of history with the EU. We've spent a lot of time in the WTO. We've been in dispute settlement system over many issues. We've been rather unhappy with the outcomes of the final outcomes of, not of the cases, which the U.S. has done very well, but of the result and the impact on trade barriers. So if you look at the high-level working group report, they acknowledge that agriculture needs to be a part of this discussion. In fact, U.S. agriculture tried to make sure that agriculture was included in this. If it's going to be comprehensive, we think it needs to talk about the ag issues. So you look at the high-level working group report, it says, well, we want to look to eliminate tariffs. But of course, we have, each side has sensitive products. So maybe you don't go quite to eliminating all the tariffs, but you deal with the ones that are sensitive. You look at phase-out periods. That's all normal stuff with tariffs. And then we try to do better on the SPS issues, what they call an SPS plus chapter. So let's talk about those real briefly. And they fall with, I mean, all this...
You better spell what SPS is.
Sanitary and phytosanitary, all the food safety standards issues. Again, all of this is, to use a agricultural metaphor, well-plowed ground in the SPS area. Our pork exports, we use an issue in U.S. pork issue, something to make the meat leaner called ractopamine. EU doesn't allow that, so that's a barrier to our pork exports. There's an international standard for it. It's safe for use here. The Codex has a standard. We still have a barrier there. John referred to the chlorine washes that our industry uses. Has been judged safe, still not allowed in. We've had issues for how many decades did beef hormones go on? And we made it a deal to sell hormone-free beef, and we've been working on lactic acid washes, which the EU has recently said are okay. Again, these issues stop our meat trade. Really, we think cost us a lot of sales there. And then we have the issues, as John said, with biotech, the GMOs, and the approval process in the EU. They get around to it, but it takes forever. So we have issues of timeliness in there. And then the EU wants to talk about geographic indicators, where you put where it came from and change food labeling. You know, the U.S. doesn't want to talk about that. We're not in favor of that. So, you know, the EU for us is a market for agricultural products. They're a source, obviously, of foods for U.S. consumers, and they're a competitor in third country markets. So there's a lot of relationship between us. On tariffs, you know, we talk about the SPS issues, but there's also good old-fashioned tariffs that we have to talk about. EU's bound agricultural tariffs average about 18%. Ours average about 10%. Again, bound tariffs, not applied, but that's what's in their tariff schedule. and those can go up and down. Most of those concentrated in meat and dairy products. So you see there's a relationship between SPS issues and tariff issues and the products that countries want to deal with differently than others. You know, we have, certain things trade freely, other things have barriers, and I think that's what part of this negotiation needs to talk about. On tariffs, we talked about a lot about this in the Doha round with the EU. A lot of this was discussed, and I imagine the discussions will probably resemble those of a few years ago. If you looked at the notification letter that was sent to Congress by USTR last week, there were several points in there where agricultural issues were included. So certainly this is going to be a part of it. But one thing you didn't see, and one thing that both sides have agreed to, that they're not going to talk about domestic farm support programs. They leave that to the WTO discussions, so that's not going to be involved. There was something called confidence-building measures. Seeing in the run-up to this, are the sides really willing to talk about issues? The U.S. had some issues, again, lactic acid for our washes for our beef exports, imports of live swine that the EU agreed to do. So they agreed to do some of these things. They've had some requests of us, mostly dealing with animal science approvals for some animal diseases, avocados and apricots. Sometimes these seem like small issues, but politically, remember, they're important to somebody in some nation, somewhere. If they're important to some group of agriculture, they're important to a government. So some of these may seem like small issues, but they can be a big deal when it comes to these things. Let me just conclude with a couple overall points here. Trade agreements have in the past and continue in the future, they work on tariffs. And if you look at a lot of them, they end up lowering tariffs over time. But in this discussion, we take that and we add this discussion with the EU about these non-tariff barriers. And they exist because somebody wants them. And they probably haven't changed that want a lot over time. So these will be, again, issues that if they were easy, as they say, they'd have been solved. But we think this is an opportunity to talk about them again. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Mike?
Great.
Take off.
Just a note at the beginning that I'm speaking on my own behalf and not anyone else. But great conversation so far. I'll keep my comments succinct so that we can get to questions. Bob asked me to be positioned as the optimist. I'm okay with that on this panel, but after listening to Dave, can I be the cautious optimist? And I think that's warranted. The size of this economic relationship that we're talking about dwarfs any other where we've considered doing a trade agreement, at least any since NAFTA. I mean, we have potential gains just in exports in the tens of billions of dollars. I think Thea's point about being very careful about predictions, both in terms of exports, employment, economic growth, are well-founded. And I think, I think over time we've gotten better at being more careful with those predictions. Let me start with a point that John made, which is during the discussion of the high-level working group, even right up until the very end, there was held open the possibility of, is an FTA the right answer to further the relationship? And there was always discussion of a plan B. I think the two governments made the right choice. I think the FTA is the right vehicle to accomplish these goals. And I think it can be summed up in kind of the old saying that if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. John, I think, discussed very well the difficulty that we've had in kind of an issue-by-issue approach. That sort of, siloed work has led to progress that really hasn't satisfied either side. So by bringing these various issues and others into a single undertaking, putting them under a mandate from the leaders, putting them on a realistic timetable for conclusion, I think is the right way to go. And we have a solid baseline to work from. Obviously, we have a large economic relationship to begin with. It is a relatively open market. But also consider the fact that the United States has currently 20 FTA partners. Of those, the EU has signed agreements with 11. So if we just start from a basis where we give to each other those commitments that we've already made to common trade partners, we can build for there. Korea is the most obvious example. So we can get this done. The most, I think, interesting and potentially beneficial aspect of the negotiation is the regulatory cooperation piece. I also think it's the least understood, and that's understandable because this is really the area in which this discussion has the potential to be truly innovative. I mean, there have been different studies looking at this question. One from a couple of years ago looked at 23 different sectors in the US and Europe and found that if you eliminated just half of the divergent regulations between the two sides, you could generate economic gains of $200 billion on each side of the Atlantic. So we have the gains from trade by addressing tariff and non-tariff barriers. We have even greater gains to be had from increased regulatory cooperation. So what does that mean? As I think about it, and we don't know yet, it's being defined, I think of it as in two baskets. I mean, one is sort of cross-sectoral cooperation. This is really working on regulations upstream, looking at proposed regulations that have significant transatlantic trade effects and creating mechanisms for a consultation process to see, to understand the true impacts of those regulations on our trade and investment relationship, to see whether those legitimate governmental objectives are being met with ways that really increase the compatibility of our regulatory regimes in ways that minimize restrictions on trade. This is something that can be done across sectors, and again, under the political mandate of a trade negotiation, I think we can hopefully achieve more progress there. The second area is in sector-specific cooperation, and here what you would have is basically, self-identified sectors where they say, look, market participants on both sides of the Atlantic are subject to regulation. And where those regulations achieve comparable outcomes, you ought to be able to substitute compliance with one for compliance with the other. But I think it's important that in this sector-specific discussion, regulators will need to have a menu of options. I mean, mutual recognition can't be achieved in all sectors. And even in sectors where it's possible, it might not be possible for the whole regulatory regime. In other words, a food, drug, or financial regulator might see aspects of the European regime that are comparable to ours, but others where they have an area that's not addressed. You can achieve mutual recognition in steps and recognize those parts where the regimes are comparable. I would urge you to pull up an interesting speech that Acting SEC Commissioner Elise Walter gave on Sunday. It was actually a video conference in Australia, so Monday their time. But she described mutual recognition and how it really is essential, particularly in the case of financial regulators, to avoid having colliding jurisdictions. I mean, there are few transactions anymore that are purely national. So I think she's onto something really interesting. But in other areas, you might base recognition on the quality and legal authorities of the regulator. And in that case, that might be sufficient. In other areas, there might be limited exemptions where you choose not to apply your regulations in certain situations. The US and the EU do this already. I mean, for example, European broker-dealers can engage in transactions in the United States without being registered here if they're dealing with a sophisticated investor who's really able to see, is this broker-dealer, a reputable firm. So we do this, and yet we don't reflect those commitments in our trade agreements. This is an opportunity to do just that. And in some cases, they're not going to be able to come to agreement during the course of the negotiation. And that's why you need mechanisms that allow this work to continue. Again, under sort of the political supervision of a trade agreement that is striving to have our regimes be more compatible. Thea mentioned that, this is not necessarily all a good thing, and, there could be bad outcomes here. I agree with that. I think, there are skeptics of this process, and there are critics. The skeptics say, sure, wouldn't it be great? But this is just too sensitive, too difficult to do in a trade negotiation. I understand that, but I think that if ever we're going to make progress, this is the negotiation to do it. I mean, no two trading partners kind of have a more similar general perspective on health, safety, environment, prudential standards than do the U.S. and the European Union. So, this is the opportunity to try to get it done. And it's off to a very interesting start. I mean, I believe it is unprecedented for two potential trading partners to issue a joint request for comments from industry saying, what can we do to increase the compatibility of our regulatory regimes and increase trade and investment? And also unprecedented that you have all of these different sectors, not one side versus the other as you normally have in a trade negotiation, but joint proposals from the pharmaceutical industry, from the auto manufacturers, from the personal care products, you name it. They are setting forward very specific proposals for areas where the two regulatory regimes achieve comparable outcomes and therefore are candidates for the mutual recognition concept that I discussed earlier. The critics have their points as well. I mean, I've heard it said, can you imagine we're going to put USTR in charge of food, drug, prudential standards? That can't be. Well, of course it can't be, and it wouldn't be. I mean, it would still be the regulators who would be deciding based on factual determinations about the compatibility of their regime with the Europeans as to whether this is an area where we can make progress. So when you hear people say, look, okay, sure, you want food and drug safety in so that it can be traded off against goat cheese. No, this actually is it's a different dynamic. Again, it is one setup so that the two regulators will together decide on the basis of the evidence of their regimes whether they can make them more compatible. You hear it said that, well, how can you take important discussions that are going on an international basis and have them part of just a US-EU dialogue? And there I would say, look, in many of these international fora, if the US and the EU can actually get together and hammer things out bilaterally, the multilateral process will go much easier. The emissions trading scheme comes to mind as just one. Again, if the U.S. and the EU can hash that issue out in this context, well, then the negotiations in the ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization, will go much better. Let's stop now so we have at least 35 minutes, I guess, for questions. And Bob, thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's excellent, really. I can't imagine all taken all together a better beginning to a really good conversation, and I'm glad it's being recorded. So, who has the first question? Could it be Catherine Hauser? Great.
That's the first question. Since we're sitting here in the Rayburn building, how can we get this done without TPA?
We're going to have TPA. Welby's working on it right now. Well, not right this minute. No, but seriously, it's a very good question. Personally, I was very encouraged by the response that Ambassador Morantis gave at the Finance Committee hearing last week. I think that the chairman and ranking members of Ways and Means and Finance are engaged in conversations on this, and maybe I'm optimistic on everything. I'm optimistic on that as well.
Yuta. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Thea.
I think in some ways I would say it's an old-fashioned question. Because I know, many years ago people used to say, nobody will negotiate with us if we don't have fast track. And that proved not to be true, because I think what happens is if you get close and you have a trade agreement that people like, that they feel confident in, then fast track is a piece of cake. And I think most of our trading partners have figured it out. So, you start the negotiating process and you see, where you can get and whether you're being responsive and addressing the kind of concerns that arise in the domestic context. TPA ends up taking care of itself. If, in fact, you come up with a controversial bad agreement, then TPA is much more controversial, as it should be.
Yuda?
Question on the regulatory issues that Mrs. Smart flagged, and yes, it would all be great if within had low blood sugar, low cholesterol, but I don't ever see any regulators coming forward other than the one example that you gave, and actually the indications. For example, the Treasury seems to be very poor to the notion of financial services regulatory cooperation. I'm a bit at a loss on, has anybody asked the regulators? And is there any indication that there is readiness? Generally, the answer to this question is, oh yes, of course, there's been consultation, but their enthusiasm is less than those of the trade people. But, you know, and when you call the agencies, you can barely get an answer. It's like, what, who, what are you asking me? So, what's your sense of how enthused the regulators are on engaging in this?
Well, I mean, I would say that it's early, and the ideas are still being developed. I mean, the Securities Industry and Futures Market Association, SIFMA, submitted a paper together with its European counterpart to USTR and DG Trade that talked about, you know, some of the things that it would like to see in the negotiations. So I mean, that's only fairly recently, as you know, same with a lot of these other proposals. I mean, the Treasury Department is dual-hatted in a sense. It is a representative of the independent regulatory agencies, and it is also, you know, a participant in trying to achieve greater market access for U.S. financial institutions. So if the responses seem, you know, less than definitive in one direction or the other, that's to be expected. It's always the case in these negotiations. So, of course, you know, regulators want to be comfortable that their legal authorities will be protected, and so you have to kind of develop these mechanisms and these negotiating objectives that really satisfy both issues. But again, just protecting those regulatory prerogatives as well as getting additional market access for U.S. firms.
Is it your sense that there are statutory mandates there in the areas where you have looked at that would prevent a regulator from engaging in this kind of cooperation? Because I understand in some cases there are statutory limits on how much information a regulator can share with another government.
I'm aware of some agencies that do have this authority. I mean, both the SEC and the CFTC can negotiate mutual recognition agreements, and have in the past. So it is something they can do, and there might be others even on this panel who know whether there's something similar with FTA or other regulatory agencies.
So who has the authority? No, I just wanted to get who has the authority? The two that you mentioned.
SEC and CFTC.
I thought John might have some insights into this because you've dealt with it, John.
Sure. I guess the one thought I would have is going back to some of the problems we faced, frankly, in the tech in terms of engaging regulators and getting movement. And I think both sides, frankly, had difficulty with this, where the political officials were anxious to move forward and thought they saw a path to move forward, only to be frustrated by regulators. And I guess the point I would make is this is going to be an agreement that's going to require constant, vigilant, aggressive engagement by high-level political officials to move the negotiations forward. It's too easy, I think, for regulators to come forward and say there is no path forward here. We're not comfortable with what you're proposing. And I think, frankly, in order to get this agreement done on both sides, there's going to have to be some political pressure to ensure that that answer is not an acceptable one, and that there is a push to move the negotiations forward.
Dave or Thea, do you have a comment? Yeah, I think this is really important, and I could have counted on you to raise it, because so much emphasis has been put on the regulatory aspect of this agreement, yet even Commissioner de Gucht said in the European Parliament about 5 weeks ago that, well, if we're going to really do this regulation piece, we should just basically accept that all existing regulations are kind of grandfathered, and we can apply new processes, new rules to negotiations going forward. Well, that's accepting a lot of sin, and certainly wouldn't seem to be consistent with the stated goals in the various the vision statements of the two sides. No. So I'm just really I really think this is a crux of this negotiation, and comes back to Thea's point about what it is we really want. What is it we really want here? And do political officials really want to secure harmonization, coherence, whatever verb you want to use, in this in the regulatory sphere, or is it simply a wish, a hope? And Dave, what do you have to say?
In the food safety area, you have several, I guess, bodies, I'll call them, that have a role in this. All the WTO members, to follow the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, and through that, they participate in the Codex, the International Food Standards Organization, or the World Animal Health Organization that sets standards for trade in animals and meat products. And if you don't want to follow those standards, you have to have a good, scientifically justifiable reason why your standards are going to be different. So you get activity within the Codex or within the OID to establish the standards, which is the regulatory agencies participate in, represent their governments there. And then you can have these bilateral issues where one side says, well, you're not following what was in the standard, and we don't think your reason is good enough. So that's part of where we are with some of, and as you'll see in these food safety things, you always see references to what the Codex is doing, or what some regulatory body is doing, or how that's doing with the SPS agreement in the WTO. And a lot of the issues in agriculture and food that I talked about before come down to countries or the European Union or saying, well, we want to do something differently. And somebody saying, well, that really isn't up to the international standard that we think you should be following, and we, have to discuss your reasons for doing that, to put it politely. So that's where we are.
Please. Dave, yes, thanks. We'll come back to that.
I just wanted to add one quick point as sort of a general overall point in terms of regulation and the scientific basis, which is, in principle, I'm a believer in science, but it's also true that I think for a lot of things, and food safety can be one of them, that there is not an objective criterion for what is, for example, level of acceptable risk. It's perfectly possible that different countries could see a cancer risk differently and could judge it differently. And I would say from the point of view of the labor movement, our bias is going to be on tolerating more differences in a regulatory regime if they come from a good place. And I know on the business side, that's generally irritating.
So I wanted to flog this horse a little bit harder. You guys all represent decades of experience in watching how political officials, how much influence political officials have on regulators. In your experience, if a political official really wants something and the chairman of the Fed or the SEC really doesn't, what's going to happen? I know that's a little stark, but
it is, and it's look. It's not. It's not a matter of one side winning and one side losing. I think it's really creating an environment that is more conducive to getting into an agreement. Nobody here is going to, second guess the sort of the judgments of regulators about the safety of whatever it is they're regulating. But there has to be a way. Again, it's not in their mandate to achieve greater compatibility with other regimes. It's to create an effective regime here, and so, that mandate needs to sort of be created, and a trade negotiation is a good opportunity to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Welby. Good.
I don't quite see it, because the Europeans don't necessarily have an interest in changing the way we account for trade finance in Basel III. And we don't necessarily have an interest in changing theirs. I mean, I guess we could if sort of leveling the playing field idea. But I'm not sure I see how that falls in the context of a bilateral conversation. It's more about what are we doing to ourselves that maybe we don't need to be doing to meet Basel III standards.
The Europeans who are active here raise it because
Right.
So Anastasio, this isn't fair, so you don't have to answer. But I was wondering if you could say what the objectives. I mean, going back again to Thea's point, what is it we really want? What are the objectives of the telecommunications sector? Anastasio Ramos represents Verizon. A little louder. Oh, can you come up here? Talk about getting put on the spot.
Well, one item, I think it's the cross-border data flows and the issue of privacy in the EU and how that will play out. So that's one of the main items, I think, that I would address.
All right. Good point. Good question. Does anybody have any idea how to agree on it? Well, it's agree on a regime in which both sides can, in their own way, equivalently protect personal privacy. It's an extremely vexed question, and I don't know whether anybody on the panel wants to try that or not. But I'd be happy. You? No? No? All right. Yuda.
I just wanted to, not that I understand the details, but it's pretty clear that that is a huge issue for the EU. The Gucht has gone as far as saying he doesn't want that in the agreement, in the meeting with the INTA. And I heard an interesting link to, oh yeah, of course we want to address that. And at the same time, of course, one would need to address air transport services and more cabotage. So, of course I want to do it, but the price is X and the price is such that it's probably not going to happen. So I think that's, we wrote a
Indeed.
I guess a question for Dave. Back to your well-plowed ground. I know we were always at loggerheads on SPS, cautionary principle, and then EU on geographic indications. Over time, can you give us some feeling of, has there been a track record of give and take in smaller ways?
Yes. There have been some agreements within the last several years. I can't extrapolate whether they're going to mean a lot for this big discussion, but just to enumerate them. What year was it we did the wine labeling agreement? That goes 8-10 years ago, whatever that was. So that was 2 decades in the discussion. That took a long time. Last year, the EU and US did a organic foods agreement. So they were able to come together on that. And after also about 2 decades of cases and discussions and carousel retaliation, the US and the EU in 2009 came to an agreement on beef, where they would allow a certain amount of that hormone-free. And over time, where there was not much of that product, and it's not a big market, I think it's now up to about 40,000 tons, but U.S. is supplying into that market, and that was what was related to this issue of the lactic acid type washes that we used that the EU, as one of these confidence building measures, approved in February. So yes, there has been some agreements on some outstanding issues, but some of the bigger ones, as you mentioned, precautionary principle, go back to 2 different approaches on science or risk assessment that we have that really is in the way the Codex works and the SPS agreement works and the EU approach. And how much we're going to be able to get into that fundamental difference in this negotiation. But I think if you're going to get to some of these other issues that are a symptom of that, you may have to talk about that. And that will probably take its time.
Farrow?
Sure, thank you. You mentioned that agricultural subsidies is just an issue that is touched. Are there any other substantive areas that might be left just not on the table?
Well, I mean, in the working group, in the report, it talked about, look at tariffs, which there are several there, as I said. Look at SPS issues. I mentioned some. I mean, there may be others I haven't mentioned. And in the ag, in our relationship on agriculture, that's where the problems have been, as I mentioned, the precautions. So, the other overall issues that, some of the bigger issues not to be discussed. But I think within a bilateral relationship, I think that covers the main points.
Second question. Last week, Kerry was met with the President of Turkey, and he mentioned something along the lines of, I would like to see Turkey perhaps be part of it. Is there the risk, but is there the possibility that we might sort of see that a lot more perhaps not members, our side of the Atlantic?
Was that comment of the Secretary approved by the White House? I think this has been. Is there a response? You're not getting a response. Okay.
No, I am just this is more of a conversational topic.
Listen, I've been present for lots of conversations about this, the potential for this agreement, starting in December, year before last, when it was first broached by the White House, and on the occasion, I think, of a leader's visit in December 2011, right? And it was greeted with just an amazing level of visionary statements by the Business Roundtable and by our counterparts in Europe. It was really, I think, surprised everyone that particularly the Europeans grasped this straw so firmly. And in the conversations since then, there has been a similar level of rhetoric and vision, but not a lot of detail. And that has been frustrating to a lot of people. I went to a program on the regulatory aspects at the Cato Institute a month ago, and nobody could get below 30,000 feet. It is very hard to get the rubber on the road with some of these issues. I think we've come very far today in getting the rubber on the road, and that is hearing in detail about some of the problems that are there that we hope can be addressed. And I think, again, returning to Thea's statement, what's really in it? What's really in it for us? What are we willing to pay a political price for is going to be key. And I really appreciate Michael's closing comments, the overall tone that this is an opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity to make progress on a bunch of issues that have been extraordinarily intractable, that should be resolved just because it's in the interest of both economies and the global economy, and because both sides at the end of the day have a strategic advantage if they join together and become much more of an entity, a whole, in speaking on common ground and taking common ground on the economic issues and perhaps even the political ones. So thank you all very, very much. This has been a great conversation, and I appreciate your being here, and thank you. So.